different from like me inviting everyone earlier today.
Yeah, that would be, of course, yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah.
So we are live now.
Cool.
So let me just make sure that I also have that running in the background so I can answer any questions if they're there.
Yeah.
I'll do that later. All right, so I'll let the people into the room as well here.
Yeah.
And there we go.
I'm sharing it to different pages and stuff.
All right. So since we are live, I think we can start.
Yeah.
Welcome everyone on Facebook and also on Zoom for this edition of 𝗕𝗵cie Talks. Today we have with us Bjrn Ihler, who's a friend of mine. I've known him for many years already. Sorry?
That's good pronunciation.
Is it?
Yeah.
Oh, good. I'm glad. It's not the easiest one, and also typing your name is not always easy.
Yeah.
But we're happy to have you here. I've been wanting to have you on this talk for a long time already. It's one of those things I've been planning. Just to introduce you a little bit to everyone who's listening who doesn't know you yet. So Bjrn is an internationally renowned expert. That's a nice thing to be in countering and preventing radicalization into violent extremism through the design of healthier communities on and offline. He's the co-founder of the Khalifa, am I pronouncing that correctly, or is it Khalifa? Khalifa-Ihler Institute, which works to promote peace, human rights, and thriving communities. He's also a fellow of the Kofi Annan Foundation, from the member of the group Extremely Together, which I think we'll hear something about as well. I think this is something very interesting.
Yeah.
And has been working tirelessly to promote anti-extremism and radicalization programs and techniques and strategies. And just wanted to also a little bit, before I give the word to you, introduce a little bit why I invited you on this talk, because your topic is not particularly migration issues, you might think, but one thing we try to do in these conversations is to look at the concept of migration not in a singular way, not in a way that it's only about people moving from one place to another, but also the effect and the impact it has on our societies and our communities, and often the negative impact it has from both sides. And just want to from the very beginning emphasize that a lot of the time when we talk about extremism and migration in that context, we always think about extremism from the side of the migrant, of the refugee, and that is something that we don't want to talk about, at least not in that sense. And but we do want to explore where the overlap is and how we can promote stronger communities and build bridges between migrant communities and host communities. So that's what I think we were talking about the other day, right?
Right.
So what is your experience, Bjrn, with these kind of issues? I mean, how in your work how have you encountered these the issues of extremism when it comes to migration issues and in society?
So of course, in Europe there and in the US and kind of the Western world, if you like to call it that, we have a lot of hostility against migrants. A lot of that hostility results in violence from the people who have inhabited those parts of the world for some time, or claim at least to have some generational belonging there over others. And I think like there's a lot of stuff going on there in terms of far-right extremism, hate crimes, Islamophobic extremism, neo-Nazism, call it whatever. We're way better at having a wide range of labels when it comes to extremism from white people, basically, because we like to grain it down into as fine grains as possible, so we can't say that it's a global phenomenon, which it obviously is. And we have kind of a long history of that, which stems back from even from kind of the Age of Enlightenment. If you look to my own constitution, the Norwegian constitution, like it had originally sections of it that were banning Jews and Jesuits from the Kingdom of Norway.
Right.
So like we had institutionalized racism, even in what we like to call the most liberal place on the planet. Institutional racism is, of course, not gone anywhere yet. Now it's manifesting in different ways, and it's also manifesting a lot in how our migration systems work, in how migrants from different countries and from different areas are treated very differently when they are arriving in Europe, both from the authority perspective, but also from the local community and the people who should be welcoming them, right?
Right.
So there's a lot of stuff going on there. Another thing we tend to forget when it comes to, if we look at migration purely as the movement of people, we in Europe have taken kind of a victimhood perspective to a lot of kind of the terrorism elements that we often speak about when we speak about migration. We say that terrorists are coming to Europe. We've had like a couple of terrorist attacks in Europe, largely executed by people who were born and raised in Europe.
Right.
Even when we try to externalize them and say, no, their great-grandfather was, Syrian or something. A lot of the people who were involved in the terrorist attacks in France, in Belgium, etc., were people who had been basically born and raised, and for those who were born elsewhere, had been living a large portion of their lives in Europe.
Right.
So we have that side of things, but also we've exported a lot of terrorists. So Norway, again, like the example I know the best because I'm from there, had about like 120 or so people go off to join ISIS.
Right.
And that's a significant amount of terrorists from Norway who have gone to join a terrorist group and terrorize a country that we are now reluctant to receive refugees from. And I'm like,
yes.
What the hell is going on in our heads when we're saying the people who are coming from there, we fear them, we put them through years of interrogation and mistreatment and skepticism, and then like the additional level of racism just in like being able to find a life here. And at the same time, we have exported
so much,
120 terrorists to the country they are fleeing. Like there's just like this cognitive dissonance there. But I think we see a lot of in different.
But I think, I mean, we don't have time obviously to go into the foundations and the reasons for racism and all these xenophobia. I mean, but that's obviously where the cause is as well, and also about marginalization and of our own population groups in society. But one thing that I find really interesting, and that's really what I wanted to talk to you about as well, is because what are the things we can do, in fact, to change this rhetoric, to change this way of thinking, and not always look at the solution to the problem as migrants have to integrate, or we have to find an integration model that fits and that makes it, sort of like that. And even when we talk, even in the more progressive way of talking about integration, when what a lot of people are doing now, where it's integration from both sides, and that sounds really nice, but I mean, you think we should go beyond that, right? I think when we were talking the other day about inclusion and especially diversity, how diversity can actually be a driving force in fighting, or in resolving this issue. We didn't want to use the word fighting because it sounds so but what can we do? What are some of the ideas that you in your institute, and also in your experience, have had? What can we do to make diversity the driving force as a solution against radicalization and extremism?
So I've spent a significant amount of time in my life kind of traveling around and meeting with former extremists, whether those were members of far-right extremist groups, left-wing extremist groups, separatist groups, like Islamist extremist groups of all different varieties. And one of the uniting factors behind kind of all forms of extremism is the idea of supremacy, but also the fear of diversity. So all extremist groups want basically everyone to be the same in many ways. Like ISIS wanted everyone to follow their interpretation of Islam, which obviously very few people actually follow, including ISIS largely. Far-right extremists might want everyone in their society to be white Christian men. They might not want Muslims in their area, etc. Like we see a lot of these different narratives, but like what it all boils down to is in essence that they don't want diversity. They feel they are superior to other people, and thus that's one of the argumentations for not wanting diversity. And a lot of it is also fear-based, so they fear diversity. Essentially, a lot of the work we're doing to counter extremism, to fight back against this, I like using the word fight back sometimes. I'm not a violent guy, obviously, but I think it's okay to use language people understand. And fighting back sounds fair enough.
Sounds good, yeah.
That's what we're doing. Let's be honest about it. One of the best ways to fight back is to embrace diversity, to celebrate the fact that we are living in diverse societies, and that's actually something that's giving us strength. So while extremists see diversity as a weakness, we see it as a strength. We see that we are learning a lot from people coming from different perspectives, having different backgrounds. You and I have different backgrounds, and that gives us room for having this conversation, right?
For sure.
And we wouldn't be able to have original ideas, original thoughts. We wouldn't be able to come to new conclusions, find new solutions, explore each other and the world in the ways we are able to, because we have diversity. And so really a lot of the work is about kind of changing the mindset from fearing diversity to celebrating it and embracing it. Now that's easier said than done in many
Exactly.
And again, we come down to kind of this idea of fear and people being uncomfortable with people being different from them, which we see a lot of, right? Pretty much everywhere in the world, people are hesitant to new things, and it's always somewhat a challenge to leap to that. And I think like
But that, for example, is because obviously we're talking, and you made the example, we have different backgrounds and we're talking, but we do have also something in common, and that's the work we do and the attitude we have towards things, and how we look at the world, and I think that's very similar in many ways, and that's why we're having this conversation. And a little bit, the people who are watching this are also, again, similar people, and so to use the expression, preaching to the choir, is I think something that is always fascinating me about everything that we do, even the projects, even Project Phoenix, and all these things that we're trying to do when we're trying to raise awareness about issues, even these talks that we're doing.
Yeah.
It's very nice to have a lot of people in a room that all agree with you, and that sort of say, yeah, yes, migration is great, and diversity is the best thing that happened in my life. But what about, what about those that don't come to these talks and are not interested, and the ones that, are the ones that think extremely,
Yeah.
Do you have, how do we bring that diversity to them? How do we convince them? Or how do we even plant the seed for them to be interested in this and to change their minds and to change their attitudes? Do you have any experience with this?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the work we've done has largely been about kind of overcoming that. Like, how do we reach the people we want to reach? And it's always a challenge, and it's difficult to come with like a top-down prescriptive model for that will fit every need. Obviously, one of my kind of work mottos is always be sneaky, like always find sneaky ways of introducing things.
Right. Okay.
Planting seeds of doubt, like having conversations with people is usually kind of the starting point for everything, right? And so my encouragement to people is always like the homework I give people is grab a cup of tea with someone who is radically different from you. Like a lot of us who are kind of in the choir, if you like, have neighbors who are not. Go have a cup of tea with them and have a chat about how you might view the world differently, and they might at least start reflecting and thinking about their world. Because, like, honestly, a lot of us are just sitting around believing the things we believe in. We don't really interrogate that or challenge.
Right.
And so, like, encouraging thinking, if I could be so blunt as to say that, encouraging kind of the interrogation and the cognitive processes is a really good starting point for helping people along the road towards accepting diversity more. A lot of it also has to do with their own comfort, right? So as I touched upon, people are often enormously uncomfortable with things that are different from them, or things they have been told they should be uncomfortable with as well. And so, first of all, challenging kind of the belief systems that make us uncomfortable is one element. But another element is to create comfort in many ways. Many of the people who I spoke to who have been in extremist groups explained that some of their lashing out was an act of self-defense, right? And a lot of that had to do with their identity feeling threatened. Like they, at the core of their beings, they felt that the world wanted them to change. The world was changing around them in ways that they didn't have control over. And a lot of that has to do with their identity and who they are and how they fit into all of this. I think approaching that with empathy is important. Don't, allow it necessarily, but understand it, right? And so that is a starting point again, but then also look at how can we essentially build confidence? Like, how do we build what I like to call strong positive identities? Like, extremists have strong negative identities where their identity leads them to be violent. How do we create an identity where you are so comfortable with yourself that you don't feel threatened by other people being different from you? And that's
very difficult, right? I mean, because you said earlier, it's about challenging people's conception. When I have a neighbor who's has an extreme view on let's say, since we're talking about migrants, about foreigners, and the concept of foreigner, I look different, I talk different, I am different. For me to go over there physically and knock on that person's door and say, hi, let's have a cup of tea, I think that's not realistic. It's not going to happen. I mean, it's dangerous. I'm putting myself in a physical dangerous. I don't know what that person's going to do. And it takes a lot of putting my own feelings aside for able to do that. So my question for you in this particular case is, like, do you feel that there are ways of mediating this process? Is there someone like you or like us or like a group of, who can come in between and say, okay, let's meet, bring those two people together? I think that's what you've been doing as well. But how do we really do that on a large scale? And how do we do that really about communities and society rather than about, doing a workshop here and there and, changing two people's minds? I mean, I know that if we change one person's mind, they might change someone else's mind. I think that is of course it. But how do we think about this bigger? How do we think about this as a society, as a community?
I sat out in this work largely with kind of the mindset of, if I change one person, if one less person becomes a terrorist, then that's my goal, right? And the problem is, first of all, there's several people out there. One person is good, but not enough. Also, it's impossible to measure whether I've reached that or not. So let's spread the carpet as widely as possible, right? When it comes to your neighbor, like, you're Belgian, you are in Belgium, as far as I know. And like, you are on my side here, where you are essentially where your neighbor will see you as being from there. At the same time, you have a different worldview from him. So like for you, it wouldn't necessarily be putting you in physical harm to go have a
Right.
conversation with your neighbor. The problem on kind of this side of the fence is that like I'm a white guy here in Scandinavia talking about this. You're a white guy in Belgium talking about this, but largely the spaces of people talking about extremism are filled with non-white guys. It's seen as a problem that affects people of color, people who are from different backgrounds, to some extent, the LGBTQ community, etc. Like it's seen as a minority issue.
Right.
While in reality, the problem is held by people like us. Like the problem of neo-Nazis aren't brown people, it's young, angry white men like me. And I am much better positioned to safely have a conversation with a young, angry white guy than, a queer black guy who,
True.
just by showing up, be beat down. And so, like, a part of my platform has always been like, I know I'm privileged. I have a lot of privilege as a young white guy. Let's use that for all it's worth to extend that privilege to as many other people as possible. So with that as a starting point, like I have a responsibility almost as, looking the way I do and being who I am to challenge neighbors with challenging worldviews.
That's true.
So yeah, I think like use that as kind of your own encouragement. That goes to all the white guys watching out there. But of course, like everyone has various ways in which we are interacting with each other and various touch points we interact with each other in. I think I've been asked a lot to talk about how the internet is radicalizing people. I don't think the internet is radicalizing people in itself. I think one of the factors that is the most problematic is that we, through the conveniences of being able to order stuff within the hour on Amazon, aren't seeing the shopkeeper down at the corner who might have a different background from us. Like we are more capable right now because of technology to isolate ourselves and to only speak to people who look and think the same as us.
Right.
That is amplified both by kind of the conveniences of being able to order stuff to your door without having to interact with anyone. Like right now, you should probably not interact with people because of the whole COVID thing. But like generally speaking, like whenever this might come to an end and also good, it was still possible, to self-isolate essentially. And we are very good at doing that as humans. It's also somewhat in our biological nature. But that's besides the point. We also isolate ourselves with the people we agree with in our social media feeds, etc. And so kind of poking out beyond like your bubble. I gave a TEDx talk in Maastricht a couple of years ago about bursting bubbles. And I still very fundamentally believe that, by bursting your own bubble from the inside and by bursting other people's bubbles from the outside, by going into those spaces also online, like you can do that without putting yourself in harm's way. But you can have those conversations, but you need to approach it still with empathy. Because what I see a lot of is people going online and like going berserk at people they disagree with. No one's going to listen to you or give you the time of day if what you do is attacking them. Like from a neurological perspective, what happens when someone attacks your worldview is like your brain goes into defense mode in the same way it would if you attacked physically. And so, of course, they're not going to listen to you. So the question then is like, how do you develop a good strategy for having constructive conversations with people you agree with? I think there's a lot we can learn, like everyone, about that, right?
I do think so, yeah. And I think, the concept of, the change has to come from within our own societies before we can build bridges with our community. This is like very, very basic concept of you have to heal yourself first before you can heal others. But I do wonder, also on a political level, let's take a place like Norway or Sweden where, which you know better, of course, but that's why I'm asking, where the right-wing extremism has been on the rise significantly in the last few years.
Yeah.
And so much even that we hear about it a lot, about Sweden, for example, being, or Norway for that matter, being such a beautiful democracy where everything is beautiful and everyone's happy, and suddenly there's all these neo-Nazis running around. But I'm wondering, and I'm you as a person, but also as an institute and an academy, and what you're doing, do you try to reach out also on a political level, or do people in your environment do that with political parties? So I'm not talking about the most extreme groups, but with those that actually come into power and actually have the potential to really do a lot of damage. Is that possible? Is this kind of rhetoric that you just saying, like, the white man to white man conversation, is that working? Do you have examples of it actually being successful?
So working with politics is like working with party politics, parliamentary politics is challenging sometimes, and I might accidentally have said that on Pakistani television this morning that the parliament in Norway has a few right-wing extremists in it, in context of a trial that's going on right now against a man who attacked a mosque in Oslo. Which is the second kind of significant far-right terrorist attack in Norway in less than a decade. I think like that's worth noting, right? And in Sweden, as you say, like there's been a growth of the far right, and that's like a couple of weeks ago we had Nazi flags like flown across a bunch of different cities in the south of Sweden.
Right.
There's a significant kind of show of power from both outright Nazis, but also from the Nazis in suits who are in our chambers of power, and people vote for them, right?
Right.
So the problem with party politics is largely the flaws of democracy, and people are seeing it in the US, people are seeing it in the UK. I'm sure you're seeing it in Belgium. I know people have seen it in France. Like people, like politics from that level is largely about populism. And a lot of the ways in which to easily gain votes is by scaring the crap out of people and asking them to vote for you so you can save them. And that's what the far right is doing. It's a very easy game to spot. And it's very hard to fight back.
Because probably a lot of them are not even ideologically feeling this extreme. They're just abusing this rhetoric and the methods to get into power and to hold on to power. So there's not much point in convincing them, because they probably don't even believe that much in what they're saying. Perhaps, I don't know.
I mean, most people are probably not like what we would categorize as far right extremists, right? They might have some problematic worldviews and whatnot.
Right.
But they're not going to go out there and shoot a bunch of people. So that's a redeeming quality in people. But, most people are within some sort of normalcy when it comes to at least the violence of their beliefs or their willingness to act on that. So, like, it's a good starting point for a lot of things. But I think when things like the financial crisis in 2008 happened, a lot of people felt very insecure about their futures, about their jobs. I mean, it's very understandable, but that people felt that a lot of people lost their livelihoods and families were struggling. Then comes essentially the growth of ISIS, and with that, and in context of the Arab Spring, etc., we saw kind of a lot of attention on problematic civil wars and on migration from the Middle East and North Africa. And in addition, we had kind of the amplification of social media. Like all of this was happening over the last decade, basically, over just a couple of years. And all of those things contribute to people feeling insecure. And then you have politicians who are like, you're feeling insecure, I want your vote. So,
but isn't it very similar
by voting,
isn't that very similar when we're looking at, again, I don't like to really divide it between, extremists in the migrant communities and extremists in the host community, because that creates a wrong image, I think.
Yeah.
But actually, if what you're saying also is that, to very simplifying it, because obviously we don't have time to go into detail, but to that extremism and radicalization often comes forth from a discontent and a feeling of often poverty and disenfranchisement. And that is the same on both sides. It's the same for the extremism in the host community that see migrants as a threat to their livelihoods or to their identity, and it's the same with the extremism that exists within migrant communities that is fed by community leaders that say, look how they're treating you, they're not they're not respecting you, they're not. So is that where it comes from? Or
I mean, if you look at the attackers in Norway, Breivik and Manshausen, who's on trial right now, they are fairly kind of middle class, upper middle class.
That's a fair point, yeah.
And so I don't really buy into this whole
class
thing. I think if you look to the realities of how ISIS, Al Qaeda, Taliban, etc., have operated in many ways more like militias, there is an argument to be made in that in those areas, people don't really have other ways of putting food on their tables, and so they join a militia that happens to be a terrorist group because of like how we like to distinguish between those two people.
Right.
Because like that's where you get a job. Like if you live in rural Pakistan, your crop burns because of fire, and you struggle to put food on your table, Taliban is there and offers you a job for holding a gun for them. Those aren't necessarily hardline ideological, etc. And so I think it's important to make that distinction when it comes to the finances of this. But like when it comes to who becomes violent in Europe largely, it has way more to do with identity, the sense of belonging. Like, do I feel like I belong in this community? Or am I estranged from it? And I think like when it comes to the far-right extremists, they feel estranged from a community they see is at war with them. And when it comes to the people who go to join Islamist extremist groups elsewhere, they feel a sense of not fitting in as well. And so I think looking at it from that angle is more productive in this particular context. I think kind of the political narratives, etc., at a broader scale contribute a lot to those feelings, both the people who are kind of openly like, let's open the borders like I am, and when it comes to the far-right ideologues in parliamentary positions who are kind of validating a lot of the points of far-right extremists and making them feel that it's acceptable to feel the way they are feeling, just by virtue of doing that at the bigger stage. When it comes to like parliamentary politics and stuff like that, though, like it's worth emphasizing that yes, we're working with Parliament, we're working with the government in many ways, and we find allies for different elements of what we're doing all over the aisle. Not really on the furthest right reaches of the aisle, but we've been working with people from across large parts of the spectrum in Norway and elsewhere. But also, I find that the most rewarding work is what happens at the grassroots level, where people are meeting up and people are like actually interacting with actual real people.
Right, I agree, yeah.
And then obviously we also do a ton of work at the United Nations and European Union level to try to cast as wide a net as possible.
So what I come across a lot is these initiatives, and I really like them because I do think that at the level they work, but I also find, I'll explain. So, the whole eating together thing, this is always something that comes up and is very positive. You know, it's always nice that when you're having dinner with someone or lunch with someone, you're eating someone's food and you realize this is really tastes really good. That brings you together. And I think that in many ways, this is a great initiative and it has proven to work. But I also often sometimes find this a little bit too cliche, perhaps. You know, that we're always talking about diversity in the first, very often talking about diversity in a sense of food. And I find that sometimes a little bit, you know, it's great to start with what do we do next? We can't just say like, oh, you know, we changed this person's, this extremist views because they now like the food of someone else. It goes beyond that. And I feel like sometimes we stop at that, and it's just about having that dinner together and then people change their mind. What is your experience with this? You've probably been involved with similar events. Have you been able to take that a step further and make it more about values of people and success stories, perhaps, so, you know, to end on a positive note and think about, you know, can you give a few examples perhaps of extremist views you've changed within the context of programs that you've worked with? And this is a difficult question because you might say like, oh, I'm not sure that I can say this, but you know, is there anything that you can think of?
I mean, it's very difficult to know what someone is thinking. What we can know a lot about is how they're behaving. And I think like that's a fair kind of distinction there. Food is a great starting point for things. I love food from all parts of the world, and
Yeah,
I think if Norwegians were kind of Norway supremacists based on the Norwegian cuisine, they would quickly realize that that was not something to be particularly supreme about. We need our pizzas and we need our pastas and we need, you know, food
nice
from
fish though.
in the world. Norway would not be Norway without sushi. Then again, sushi would not be sushi without Norway, because salmon sushi was invented by the Norwegian like Chamber of Commerce.
There you go.
Yeah. So like, food is a global thing. It travels easily.
Yeah.
And most people are fairly open to exploring different cuisines. The problem is when the food kind of ends at the table. Like the food naturally is on a table, but when kind of that's the end of it,
Yeah.
I see it as a starting point for conversations that you're having over the food, and like the conversations that goes on beyond the meal as well. Like, how do you continue that conversation is kind of really the question that you're asking. And I think many programs don't really see beyond like one event, and that's a problem. How things are ran by organizations is a problem of how things are funded. Like, it's tricky to run kind of long-term things that are oriented around things that aren't really incredibly measurable.
Right.
But I think also people have been looking for a sense of belonging, looking for communities, have found them over those meals at times. But there's all sorts of different ways of creating that, of course. And I think so like I think it's worthwhile in many ways, but I think we could think more about how to have a greater impact with it. When it comes to success stories, there's been a few, and I've played different parts in it. But one of the stories that I really like is the story of Ivan, who was in the British, now in the English Defence League in Britain, and he went to a mosque basically to shout at them. From like the English Defence League perspective, that's what they do. And my friend Manwar, who was at the mosque, invited him into the mosque for a meal, as we were talking about. And that was the start of what's been a conversation going on for at least 3 years now between Manwar and Ivan. Manwar used to be an extremist as well, by the way. He was in I think it was the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. I'm not sure. You can tell his story, but they are now doing this. They are spreading stories about how they both came out of extreme communities. and about how they came to have conversations with each other that brought Ivan out of the English Defence League and made him realize where he had been and what he had believed in, and where that was coming from, and how that was hurtful to others. And that's a useful starting point for helping out others out as well. There's several stories like this. Another great one is Daryl, who played in Miles Davis's band. He's a musician. He's a black musician in the US. He has de-hooded more KKK members than anyone else in the world by traveling around and playing music in the south of the US and talking to Klansmen after concerts, which is another great one. You have Arno, who was the founder of one of the largest neo-Nazi movements in the world, and also the front person of one of the most famous neo-Nazi bands in the world, who came out after, again, an encounter over food. When he was a Nazi, he would spend his money that he earned in his job on beer, and every month when he got paid, he would also go to the McDonald's, and he had gotten swastika tattoos on his knuckles one day, and then went to McDonald's to get his Happy Meal or Big Mac or whatever. And the lady who was serving him was a black lady, and he realized that he was trying to hide his hands because, like, he wanted his burger.
Priorities.
She saw the swastikas anyways, of course, and when she handed him his burger, she just looked him into the eyes straight away and said, "I know you're better than that." And that faith in his humanity from someone he was dehumanizing was really earth-shattering and significant factor, and among other factors in him leading the movement. And now he's working with 𝗕𝗷ø𝗿𝗀, who's a survivor who lost his father in the mass shooting at the Sikh temple in Wisconsin in 2012. And they are running an organization together, which is, again, bringing people together over meals.
And I think that is the crux of the matter. I think it's about starting the conversation over a meal.
Yeah,
but
it's
then
also
making
common
sure
ground. Like, we all need to eat, and we all need food. Like, it's disarming and it's unifying just by its own nature.
Right, but it shouldn't end there. It should always be something for the start. And I think that is something that, we can do as also, as we're sitting together here. And this is also what now we're having a conversation about this, in the sense that every Phoenix talk that we're doing, we're inviting people that are sort of on in our network, but not quite yet in there yet. And this is something that we were talking about the other day as well, right? How can we, so we as an organization work with, professional and personal development of mostly migrants, of mostly refugees and asylum seekers in Europe, in a sense, to give them the opportunity to use their talents and skills in an environment that is not giving them the opportunity to do so. And at the same time, we are attempting to raise awareness around these issues of the barriers and the difficulties that people are facing and the amazing stories that people are bringing. And you're doing a very similar thing on that side of extremism. And one thing that we are trying to do better is also to, as we're doing this and we're highlighting issues that are from the migrant community, we also want to bring those stories and bring people together from the host communities and make sure that people understand each other better and see, what this other person is doing, but vice versa. And so we can learn a lot also from you in how to communicate with the host communities and organize better and more meaningful events or communication programs where we don't just work on one community and another, but how we can bring those two together. And I think that is something very important. And we can do that over dinner, we can do that over music, we can do that over a lot of things. But I think that is why what we need to do.
Yeah.
I'm going to give you the word in 1 second, because we have to wrap up to keep this enjoyable for everyone. There was a question from one on Facebook. It's a little bit late for this question, I think, in a sense that it's going more into detail what extremism is, and what the question is, how do we know that a person is extremist based on their behavior and how they behave? But I think that the point of that is really about how we can, we don't have to identify people as such. We have to, if I understand this question correctly, it's really about not giving them the opportunity to manifest, to not show these the way they are, but show them, understand, and just be I don't know, kind to each other. Sounds a bit daft perhaps, but that's is what it comes down to. And so I think that can come from both sides, or from all sides, not from both sides, from all sides. If we understand each other better, then we can avoid.
I mean, meet each other with understanding, be kind to one another. It's not daft. It's, you know,
I know, but it sounds
fundamental of
oversimplistic.
how society functions.
Yeah.
I mean, it is simple. It doesn't have to be complicated to be a good solution to things.
Right.
You know, often the best solutions are the simple solutions. I think, like, meeting each other, listening to each other, are the key elements. One of the things we often forget, like, we talk a lot about having conversations, and a lot of the time people interpret that to, you should be sharing your story, you should be speaking.
Yeah.
One of the things we forget is that listening is at least as important, if not more important, a lot of the time. Listening to people who have troubles, giving them the space to talk, first of all, gives you an insight into what they're thinking, which, you know, can be helpful in identifying who might be an extremist. But also, it allows them to think about what they are thinking in a different way. Because when you are trying to explain to someone else what you're thinking, you have to reflect over it in a different way than if it's just mulling over inside of your head, right? And that can be helpful in essentially letting people de-radicalize themselves, if you like. Because
if you tell them what to do, then it'll even get worse.
Yeah,
tell them, don't be like this, then it becomes.
But also the kind of the logical and cognitive fallacies in a lot of their thinking will become clearer to them as the words are coming out of their mouth. But then also just the sense of being listened to is really important, right? Like the feeling that someone values you and are willing to give you the time, that's a way of creating a bond. And if you don't listen to them, they for sure will not listen to you. And so I think, the value of listening is really, really key, and something we need to bring along in all of this. And also, coincidentally, one of the best answers to the question of how do we identify who's an extremist.
All right, Bjorn, I think we have to wrap it up. But I do think we should continue this conversation sometime. I do think we should start thinking about how we can do something together, and how we can learn from your experience, especially, because would be very happy to do that. And do you want to finish off with something? Do you want to promote anything that you're doing right now, or?
Yeah, we've just launched the Activism Academy. You can find it at activismacademy.com, which is a website on which we are sharing things about, well, activism and the opinions and activities of people who are trying to make the world better in different ways, including such things as Project Phoenix. You can follow the Academy on all social media. You can also follow the Khalifa-Ihler Institute, and you can follow myself on Twitter and Facebook. So
just showing you the website for a second here, so you can see it, activismacademy.com. Can you see that on my screen?
I can see it.
Okay, perfect. So thank you very much for this conversation. It's been amazing, and it's so good to talk to you again in depth a little bit more.
And let's keep the conversation going, right?
For sure. Yeah. Thanks so much, Bjorn. Thank you for everyone for watching, and see you next week.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.